The unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect truth is seldom met with, even in 1,000 myriad kalpas. Now we can see and hear it. We can remember and accept it. I vow to make the Buddha's truth one with myself. Namo tassa bhavagato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Homage to the Blessed One, the Arhat, the fully enlightened one. So today I'm going to talk about the Kalama Sutta. Okay? This is one of my favorites. I've tried in the past to explain it and never really felt I've done it very satisfactorily, so I'm hoping today that maybe I'm a bit clearer. But in this sutta, in the Kalama Sutra, we see how the Buddha teaches. Okay? And I'm just fascinated by it because it's really a great way to teach people. You know, it's not condescending, it's not authoritative. He's just the Buddha. In this sutta, so we see how the Buddha teaches. And generally, the Buddha in his Dharma teachings didn't tell people that they must do this. Okay? He didn't tell them how they should live their lives. Rather, he would present his audience with a series of questions and allow them to reason and figure out what would be the best, most wholesome, beneficial, and skillful way for them to act in their everyday situation, or if they're having difficulty in a situation. You know, he would pose questions and then let them figure it out. So I think the Kalama Sutra is a masterful example of pointing people to the truth and letting them do the running, letting them do the work, letting them make their own decision. It is probably the most quoted and unfortunately most misquoted sutta in the Pali Canon, okay, which is interesting. Okay? Some people refer to the Kalama Sutta as the Charter of Free Inquiry. Well, there's a bit of that in there. But because we human beings have different ideas of what free inquiry means, it seems that at times this Kalama Sutra is taken out of context. People use quotations from it in an incomplete and misleading way. And you know, this happens. I mean, we're famous for just reading part of something or remembering part of something, and still it might be useful. So I don't want to harp on this, but it is both quoted and misquoted. What the lesson, I think, for me is that when you read this sutta, or when you read any sutta, if there's a context to it, okay, so for example, in this sutta, the Kalamas were not disciples of the Buddha. They were earnest seekers who had been confused by all the teachers who had come through their way. So if you can get a context that can help you, you know, because the Buddha talked in certain ways to certain people to try to help them and help them answer their own question. Okay? Also, when you choose to quote something from the Buddha, choose to quote something from the Pali Canon, you choose to quote something from one of the Mahayana sutras, check the text to make sure you are quoting correctly and in its entirety. Okay? I'll give you an example of this with the Kalama Sutra. So, with some frequency, it's said that the Buddha said in the Kalama Sutra, believe nothing no matter who said it, not even if I said it, if it doesn't fit in with your own reason and common sense. So let me read that again. So it tends to be quoted as the Buddha said, believe nothing no matter who said it, not even if I said it, if it doesn't fit in with your own reason and common sense. Okay. Well, as you will see, as I read parts of this sutta, that's not exactly what the Buddha said. Okay? And it's not even quite the spirit of what the Buddha said. But maybe some words were borrowed from what he said. But there's something about really looking to what is said, and if we're going to quote it in its entirety. Okay? So if you haven't had a chance to read this sutta, I left you books up in the guest house. There's time today. It's not long. It's, I don't know, maybe 2 book pages long. Okay? But to me, it shows the beauty and skillfulness of how the Buddha taught. And I think it's a good starting point for our retreat, because we're talking about the teachings of the Buddha. So, kind of important to know how he taught. So let me give you a sketch of the Kalama Sutra. Obviously, if you read this, you already know this, but I still think it helps to have a bit of a sketch. So as the sutta starts, the Buddha is wandering in Kosala County with a large group of monks. They enter a town called Kesaputta, where the Kalama people reside. I read somewhere that Kesaputta was near a forest in which many ascetics did their practices, and as was common in those days, both by the Buddha and religious seekers and ascetics, they'd often go into town for alms food, go on an alms round. It's not just in Buddhism that that's done. And is also is common in Buddhism often. The ascetics would offer a teaching to the Kalamas after they were given food, maybe after they ate. Unfortunately, what happened was different teachers gave conflicting teaching. And what's even worse, they insisted that their teaching was the correct one. And what's even worse than that, they were disparaging, reviling, and vilifying the doctrine of others. So, the Kalamas were just confused. Needless to say, this manner of teaching by the ascetics left the Kalamas in a state of confusion and doubt as to which of these teachings was the truth. The Kalamas had heard about the Buddha and his good reputation for speaking a Dharma with right meaning and expression. So the Buddha and his disciples wander into Kesaputta, and the Kalamas are this is like a breath of fresh air, a sigh of relief. Here's the Buddha. He showed up. He's going to set us right. He's going to clear up the confusion. Which in a sense, he does clear up the confusion, but I don't think it's quite the way they thought he might have. Okay? So the Buddha listens to their story, and rather than say, "Let me set you straight," responds that it is fitting for them to be perplexed and in doubt. Also, the Buddha doesn't go after the other teachers, kind of just doesn't get into that. Rather, he chooses to make a series of statements and then proceeds to ask the Kalamas a series of ethical questions, which helps them sort this out. Okay. So let me read here the paragraph, which is sometimes, unfortunately, shortened and misquoted and taken out of context, because I think it's very important for this whole sutta. I'll sort of apologize here because I'm taking this from Thanissaro Bhikkhu's translation of the Kalama Sutra, and of course I gave you Bhikkhu Bodhi's with a pretty similar. And I prepared these talks weeks ago, and I'm sure I had some reason for doing this, but I chose Thanissaro Bhikkhu's translation for this. And what I'll do after the talk is I will leave a copy of his translation, so if you want to read that to see how it may, he may choose different words and phrases and places. Okay. So this quotation from the Kalama Sutra. Of course you are uncertain, Kalamas. Of course you are in doubt. When there are reasons for doubt, uncertainty is born. So in this case, Kalamas, don't go by reports, by legends, by tradition, by scripture, by logical conjecture, by inference, by analogies, by agreement through pondering views, by probability or by the thought. This contemplative is our teacher. When you know for yourself that these qualities are unskillful, these qualities are blameworthy, these qualities are criticized by the wise, these qualities, when adopted and carried out, lead to harm and to suffering, then you should abandon them. Okay, so that's not quite what people quote, the Buddha saying, don't believe something simply because I say it. There's a little bit more there. So it appears to me that in this paragraph that I just read, that the Buddha is clear that the Kalamas need to be responsible for what they believe, what they choose to do, how they choose to act. And as you all know, Buddhism is not about blind faith. That is, you must believe this because I say it. I'm sure just because I say something this week, you're not necessarily going to agree with it occasionally, and that's fine, okay? We each are responsible for our minds, our lives, and our actions, okay? There's no God, creator, or leader you must obey blindly. I know for some people, faith is a difficult word. Perhaps we had trouble with religion, the religions that we were raised with. And so some people like to substitute for the word faith confidence. That's perfectly okay. I've heard some people say that faith is more a verb than a noun, in that it's something you have to do. It's interactive. It's multi-sided. It just doesn't go one way. Okay, that's fine too. It's interesting because sometimes when the Buddha would give a Dharma talk, he'd ask his monks, did you understand what I said? And I gather that Shariputra occasionally would respond, no, I didn't. And then the Buddha would reply, very good, Shariputra. You're honest. So he wasn't, when he talked, requiring that everyone understand everything right now. Obviously, there are many levels of this teaching, or teachings that we find easier to take on than others, okay? Reverend Master Jiyu, when she was in the Far East, developed what she called the back burner method. I think possibly one of the monks at Sojoji mentioned this to her. So there were things that she didn't understand, okay? She actually said that many, many years later, when she told us about this, there were still a few things that Koho Zenji had said that she was still digesting. Okay? But anyway, she learned, rather than to be troubled by the fact that she didn't understand, was to ask questions. And if that didn't suffice, you have to just let it sit there for a while. Okay? So I think this can be helpful with Buddhist teachings. It isn't, you must believe this right now or get out, or you're not a Buddhist, It just takes time sometimes. In fact, the training is often referred to that we do as the gradual training. So it takes time, okay? And it develops. And it develops from our own experience of things. Sometimes we have to experience something before we understand it. I know with myself and Reverend Master Jiyu, to this day I find myself, after her death, saying, oh, that's what she meant by that. Now I understand. So in that paragraph that I quoted a few minutes ago, there's quite a list of do's, of don'ts, as well as a list of when you know for yourself. And I think something that has helped me with that paragraph how we understand things and how we approach things is this translator note by Thanissaro Bhikkhu. And actually that's why I chose to use his translation, because I found his translator's note to be very helpful. And so let me read this. Although this discourse is often cited as Buddha's carte blanche for following one's own sense of right and wrong, it actually says something much more rigorous than that. So it actually says something much more rigorous than that. Traditions are not to be followed simply because they are tradition. Reports, such as historical accounts or news, are not to be followed simply because the source seems reliable. We've got our modern time of fake news and alternate facts. This gives us some pause here. One's own preferences are not to be followed simply because they seem logical or resonate with one's feelings. Instead, any view or belief must be tested by the results it yields when put into practice. And to guard against the possibility of any bias or limitation in one's understanding of those results, they must further be checked against the experience of people who are wise. So the Buddha says this repeatedly in the Kalama Sutra about, don't do anything that would upset the wise or is something that they wouldn't do. The ability to question and test one's beliefs in an appropriate way is called appropriate attention. The ability to recognize and choose wise people as mentors is called admirable friends. So in Buddhism, we have personal responsibility, and we can ask questions, and we can seek advice. And I think that's quite open-ended and leaves a lot of space for us human beings who sometimes struggle with things or don't understand or take time to understand it. Again, that's perfectly okay. So let me go back to the sutta here and kind of my sketch of what's going on. So the Buddha then takes the Kalamas through a series of questions about greed, hate, and delusion. The Buddha asks the question whether non-perceptual actions like killing, lying, stealing, adultery, and inducing others to do likewise leads to the welfare or harm. Are they skillful? Leads to welfare or harm. Are they skillful or unskillful? Blameworthy or blameless? Criticized by the wise or praised by the wise? Well, the Kalamas, of course, answer acts of greed, hate, and delusion lead to harm. They are unskillful, blameworthy, and criticized by the wise. But he put the question to them, and they could figure it out, okay? The Buddha then turns the question around to matters where one acts with non-greed, non-hate, and non-delusion. So this is what we often call compassion, love, and wisdom. The Kalamas answer that these perceptual actions lead to welfare. They are skillful, blameless, and praised by the wise. So again, they're able to draw a conclusion from his statements and his questions. So in the sutta then, the Buddha takes a bit of a leap. So now when he starts explaining things, he says, and let me say again that the Kalamas were not followers of the Buddha at the beginning of this exchange. Okay? But the Buddha makes a bit of a leap here because I think he feels that the Kalamas are leaping with him. Okay? He starts talking about things in terms of one who is a disciple of the noble ones, devoid of greed, ill will, undiluted, alert, and resolute. And then he proceeds to teach about the four divine abodes: goodwill or loving kindness, compassion, appreciation or altruistic joy, and equanimity. Okay? The Buddha then talks about the four assurances or solaces in this very life. If there is another world after death, this is the Buddha saying this, and if good and bad deeds bear fruit and yield no result after death, one will end up in a heavenly world. If there is no world after death, and if good and bad deeds don't bear fruit, and have results, still right here in this life one lives happily, free of enmity and ill will. Suppose evil befalls the evildoer. Having done no evil action or intended evil for anyone, suffering will not afflict one. And then lastly, suppose evil does befall the evildoer. The right here and now, then right here and now one is purified. So suppose evil does not befall the evildoer, then right here and now one is purified. So in many ways here, what the Buddha has graduated the teaching to is teachings about karma and rebirth. So he's kind of gone from greed, hate, and delusion to now talking about karma and rebirth. And through the guidance of the Buddha in questions, inquiry, and basic perceptual teachings, the Kalama has come to a place where they say, "So it is, Blessed One." Okay? So they're agreeing with him. Okay? But it's their choice to agree with him. He's not saying, "You must agree with me." After hearing him and the very logical teachings that he gives, they say, "So it is, Blessed One." So throughout this sutta, the Buddha just directed the Kalamas. They had to connect the dots. Conclusions were left to them. Personally, I find it remarkable that someone could teach in this way. Okay? It's just so open-ended, so compassionate, and so liberal in its outlook. And I think what was going on is that the Buddha respected the Kalamas and just pointed them to their own store of knowledge and wisdom. So in our present world, I don't know about you, but I think I'm much like the Kalamas, okay, in my coming to Buddhism, in my working with my teacher, in my learning about our practice. And I feel very grateful for that because, in some other places there are teachers and authorities that confuse people mightily by their arrogance and insisting their way is the right way. Okay, you got to believe it right now. That's not the way Buddhism is. So the teachings of the Buddha are like a fresh breeze. It isn't that Buddhism is without doctrine or faith. But doctrine in Buddhism is about the way things are as opposed to some order from above. And it leaves us to look at our own experience of living the doctrine or not living the doctrine and looking at the consequences. It leaves us to figure it out. Faith in Buddhism, as I said, some people like the word confidence, and I think faith is very much about confidence and trust in the Buddhas and ancestors, in our fellow practitioners, in the Dharma. Okay. We are always responsible for our own lives. Okay. And if you look, the Buddhas and ancestors, the Sangha, the Dharma, they're always there to help. Okay. We're not kind of alone at sea, There's help out there. Inquiring and questioning are good things in our practice. They're okay. Sometimes we need to see how things play out in our lives. Okay? Well, I think we all know how that is. Unfortunately, sometimes we have to make mistakes to see that there's a better way, and just hopefully we don't cause too much harm with our mistakes. But sometimes people have to make mistakes to figure it out. Personally, I think that there is an unshakable faith or confidence that we can gain with our commitment to and refuge and faith in the Triple Treasure. It's not a blind faith, though. It's an eyes fully open faith and confidence in the compassion and wisdom of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. It's okay for a teacher or a student to say, I don't know. Years ago, I went with Master Hario to a religious studies class, or religions class at Southern Oregon, I guess it's university now, Southern Oregon University. And, he gave a little talk, he answered questions, and then some people asked some questions, and he just said, I don't know. And I thought that was totally liberating. Here's this person, had a fair amount of training on his belt for where we were in those days in the monastery, and he could say, I don't know, and not be worried by it. Okay? In Buddhism, we have the idea of refuge because others can help us. And when we don't know, sometimes we can talk it out with people. Even though we do this, even though we're not alone, okay, even though we can seek refuge, we are always the owners of our karma. We're responsible for our actions of body, speech, and mind. And whether we lead or follow, the responsibility is fully each of ours. Okay? I think some people think sometimes if you follow, well, you're just following. Well, no, if you follow, you chose to follow. And there's a responsibility there. That's really quite a responsibility. Okay? So at the end of this sutta, the Kalamas leave us with magnificent Lord, magnificent, just as if he were to place upright what was overturned, to reveal what was hidden, to show the way to one who was lost, or to carry a lamp into the dark, so that those with eyes could see forms. In the same way has the Blessed One, through many lines of reasoning, made the Dharma clear. We go to the Blessed One for refuge, to the Dhamma, and to the Sangha of monks. May the Blessed One remember us as lay followers have gone to him for refuge from this day forward for life. So, in a number of the suttas that kind of start out on rocky grounds, of course this didn't quite start on rocky grounds, these were just confused people, but as we go on in the week, I will at least talk about two suttas where it was pretty rocky at the beginning of the exchange with the Buddha and the other person. Okay, and whether it always ended up that people became the Buddha's disciples, I don't know, because I haven't gone through every sutta in the book. But I think most likely not. People can be very stubborn, can be very angry, can be very set in their ways, or they just want to do a different thing. So I don't think it 100% always turned out this way, that people became the Buddha's disciples. And if you read the Pali Canon, you will very soon realize that the Buddha did not lead an easy life. He ran into some extremely difficult people. He had a hard time with his disciples. It's kind of like parents with their children. And I heard recently that someone say that you don't know what it's like to be a parent until you're one. Personally, for myself, I didn't know what it would be to be a teacher until I became one, and how difficult I was as a student. Okay? I'm just glad that the Buddha didn't give up on us human beings. He saw it initially after his awakening. He thought, I don't know, this is a bit too much for people. I don't know if they can take it on. It's revolutionary, his teaching in that day in India. But he fortunately for all of us saw that there were people with little dust in their eyes, and people that would have the ability to clear that dust away and see clearly. Okay? But the Buddha didn't clear away the dust. It's his followers that cleared away their own dust. And the Buddha gave us the Dharma that is good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end. And for that I am grateful. Homage to the Buddha. in all worlds. Homage to all the bodhisattvas in all worlds. Homage to the scripture of great wisdom.